The frost on the silent terraces never melted, not even in high summer, and I told myself that was why I went up there at night, to see if the old story was true, that no snow would lie on those stones. I did not expect to find her already kneeling in it, bare-handed, clearing ice from a name no one in Hollowfrost Reach was supposed to remember. "That cairn is sealed," I said, "by my grandfather's order." She didn't startle. That was the first thing I noticed. Most of my pack flinched at my voice in the dark, even when I meant nothing by it. She only sat back on her heels and looked up at me with an expression that held no fear and, worse for my pride, no particular interest either. "Then your grandfather can come up here and stop me," she said. "I don't think he will. He's been dead 11 years. "I know," she turned back to the stone. "I tend all of them, even the ones nobody wants tended." I should have left. A king has no business kneeling in frost beside a woman the pack called the Bone Girl behind cupped hands. I'd heard the name before, never once thought about who wore it, the way you hear a bell ring across a valley and never ask which house it hangs in. But I crouched anyway, and the cold of the ground came up through my boots like something waking, and I found myself asking her name instead of ordering her gone. "Thea," she said, "Wendell. I've kept the terraces since I was 12. Alone. Nobody else would." I looked at the cairn she'd been clearing, a low mound, older than the others around it, its marker stone worn past reading, wrapped in a chain that had rusted into the rock itself. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure it stayed shut. I put my hand on the chain without thinking, and it was warm. Not sun-warm. Nothing up here had felt the sun in months, warm like something breathing under it. I pulled my hand back too fast to be dignified. Thea watched me do it, and, for the first time, something moved behind her eyes that wasn't indifference. "You felt that," she said. "Felt what?" I never say because no one ever asks twice. She stood, brushing frost from her knees, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was speaking this plainly to the Alpha King of Hollowfrost Reach. "But you asked. So yes, it does that. Every year around this time, less each year, like it's tiring. I've never told anyone because the one time I did, my aunt beat the words out of me and told me the dead don't need company from a girl nobody wanted." The wind came up through the terraces then, sharp enough to cut, and neither of us moved. "Who is buried here?" I asked. "I don't know. No records. No name on any account in the hold, and believe me, I've looked. I read every ledger in the archive room the winter I turned 16, hunting for it, until the archivist got tired of me and started locking the door when he saw me coming. Whoever she was, someone erased her on purpose." Thea crouched again, laid her palm flat against the worn stone, gentle as if she were quieting a spooked animal. "I just know she doesn't feel forgotten. Not to me. I have ruled Hollowfrost Reach for 6 years. I know every treaty my father signed, every border my grandfather bled for, every debt owed and paid within these walls. I did not know there was a grave in my own terraces that made the pack lie to keep it shut, and that unsettled me more than I let show. I'll find out who she was," I told Thea, and meant it as a king's promise, not a suitor's. She looked at me like she didn't quite believe either version. "People have said that before," she said. "They stop asking as soon as my aunt tells them the Bone Girl is touched in the head for caring." She gathered her tools, a small iron pick, a rag, nothing more, and stood to go. "Good night, my lord." I stood alone a long while after she'd gone, the chain still warm under my palm where I'd set it back down, and told myself I was only curious the way a king is curious about anything unaccounted for in his own hold. I have never been a good liar, not even to myself. My wolf did not settle the whole walk back down the terrace steps, and it had been a very long time since anything had kept him from settling. I asked my second the next morning. Over breakfast I didn't eat. Bram had served my father before me. If anyone still living knew the old shape of the hold's secrets, it was him. He had the particular stillness of a man who has spent a lifetime learning which questions to let pass through him unanswered. There's nothing to know, he said too quickly and reached for the bread instead of my eyes. An old grave, before your grandfather's time. Best left alone, my lord, some ground keeps its peace better without disturbing. The chain is warm, Bram. His hand stopped halfway to the bread. Then leave it warm, he said, and would say nothing else, no matter how I pressed, until I let the matter drop over the meal and picked it back up the moment we were alone in the hall, away from the ears of the younger wolves who served at table and would carry any strange word straight into the kitchens by noon. You knew my grandfather, I said. You must have heard something, even second-hand. I have heard the shape of a silence, my lord, not its contents. Bram's jaw worked, an old habit I recognized from the times he disagreed with my father and swallowed it rather than argue. There are things a second learns not to ask a king if he wants to remain second past the asking. You are not asking me, I am asking you. That finally moved him. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might refuse outright, the way he so rarely did. Then he said, low, ask your grandmother's sister if you must ask someone. Old Marin at the mill. She was a girl herself when it happened, whatever it was, young enough to remember, old enough that no one thinks to silence her anymore, because who would believe an old woman's stories over a king's decree? I was not born yet. I only know the elders of my father's generation were told never to speak of it, and I have kept that silence out of respect, not ignorance. Respect for what? For not knowing, Bram said, which told me more than he meant it to, and more than I wanted to hear over a breakfast I still hadn't touched. I sent word to the mill before midday. I found Marin at her spinning wheel, an old woman with hands like knotted rope and eyes that had gone milky at the edges but sharpened, terribly, the moment I said the word Cairns. You've been up the terraces, she said. It wasn't a question. I met the girl who tends it. The Windle girl. Marin's mouth thinned, and she set the spindle in her lap though her hands kept moving out of habit, worrying the thread without spinning it. Blood tells, my lord, even when no one wants it to. You should know that better than most. Your own bond will tell you things your counsel won't, if you let it speak before you silence it out of caution. Tell me what happened. Whose grave is it? She was quiet long enough that I thought she'd refuse the way Bram had. The fire in her small hearth popped and settled. Then her voice dropped to something I had to lean in to catch. The voice of a woman who has carried a story so long in silence that speaking it aloud feels like a kind of theft, even from herself. There was a Luna once before your grandfather's time. A queen the old records called Isel, though I doubt that was truly her birth name. Names got changed along with everything else that year. The way a river changes course after a flood and no one remembers exactly where the old bank used to be. She came to us from outside the pack. No lineage anyone here could trace, no house to vouch for her, and she was loved anyway. Truly loved, not the way courts love a crown out of duty. The wolves loved her the way you love weather that finally breaks a drought. Pups followed her through the halls just to be near her. The old ones say the whole reach used to gather at dawn just to watch her walk the terraces, because something in the way she moved made the morning feel like it belonged to everyone, not only to the king. What happened to her? There was a war of succession brewing, 2 brothers, both wanting the throne their father hadn't yet finished dying on, both willing to burn the pack down around them to get it first. She stood against the crueler of the 2, publicly, before the whole hold gathered for the winter rites. Called him unfit to lead wolves who couldn't trust a man not to turn on his own blood, when the day came that turning served him. It was the kind of thing that gets a woman remembered as brave for 100 years, if the wrong brother had lost. He won anyway. He won anyway. Marin's milky eyes found mine, steady despite their clouding, the way a lighthouse keeper's eyes stay steady even after the light itself has dimmed. And once he had the crown, he had her erased. Not killed outright, worse, in the old way, the way our people used to punish before we called ourselves civilized for having stopped. sealed her line out of every record, forbade her name spoken on pain of exile, chained her grave so even in death she couldn't be found and honored by anyone who might still love her. Told the pack it was for their own protection, that speaking of her invited the same ruin that took her, that grief for a traitor was itself a kind of treason. People believe what keeps them safe, my lord, especially when a king tells them to, and especially when the alternative is admitting they watched it happen and said nothing. And her family, her line if she had one. Scattered or hidden or dead, no one truly knows, and that was the design of it. That's the particular cruelty of erasing a name. You don't just lose the person who carried it. You lose the thread that would have told anyone after her who they came from, and why it mattered. I thought of Thea, 12 years old and alone on those terraces because no one else would go, tending a stone with no name on it out of nothing but stubborn, unrewarded loyalty, and something in my chest went very still and very cold, the way ice goes still right before it cracks clean through. The Windle line, I said, where does it come from? Marin almost smiled, though there was no humor in it, only the grim satisfaction of a woman who has waited a very long time to be asked the right question. Now you're asking the question worth asking, my lord. Nobody's asked it in longer than I've been alive to hear it not asked. The Windle name, when I went looking for it properly, existed in exactly 2 places in the Hold's records. A birth entry, water-damaged and half illegible, for a girl named Thea born to a woman recorded only as M. Windle, unmarried of no fixed household. And a death entry for that same mother, 4 years later, cause left blank in a hand that had clearly meant to come back and fill it in and never had. No father listed, no lineage traced backward, no explanation for how a woman with no household had come to bear the name Windle at all, when every other family in the Reach could trace itself back generations in the same ledgers. I brought the pages to Marin myself, rather than trust them to a messenger. Someone stopped looking on purpose, I said, laying them on her table. This isn't neglect. Records this thin, this precisely thin, take effort to keep thin. Marin studied the water-stained page for a long moment, her thumb tracing the blank space where a lineage should have sat. Iseult had a daughter, she said finally. That much I remember clearly, because it was the one detail nobody could fully erase. Too many people had seen the babe before the order came down. The daughter was sent away, or hidden, depending which version you believed as a girl yourself listening at doors. If she survived, if she had a daughter of her own, and that daughter had a daughter. Marin spread her worn hands over the water-damaged page. 3 generations is enough time for a line to go from queen to nobody with no household, if everyone along the way was frightened enough to stop asking who they'd been. You think Thea is that line? I think the stone thinks so, my lord, and I've learned to trust stone over people in my long life. People lie for comfort. Stone only answers what's true. I went back to the terraces that night without meaning to, the way a tongue goes back to a broken tooth, testing the ache to see if it's still there. Thea was there again, always there, kneeling by the same cairn with her rag and her small iron pick, breath fogging in the cold, and this time I didn't waste the evening pretending I'd come for the frost. I spoke to Marin, I said, and I've read the 2 records that exist of your mother, and of you. Her hand stilled on the stone. Then you know more than you did 3 nights ago. I know a queen was erased. I know her grave was sealed to keep her forgotten, and her line scattered so thoroughly that 3 generations later, a girl with no household and no name to her father grew up thinking she came from nothing, because someone made very sure the paper trail agreed with that lie. I let that sit a moment before I said the rest. I don't yet know how a girl with no family the Hold remembers ended up the only one willing to kneel in the cold and clear her name stone every winter for the better part of a decade. But I have a guess now. I think you always knew this ground before it ever knew you. Thea sat back, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something crack through the flat calm she wore like armor, not tears, nothing so soft, but a tiredness so old it looked inherited, passed down like a family trait nobody had bothered to name. "I don't have a family the hold remembers," she said. "I have an aunt who took me in because the pack shamed her into it after my mother died, and told me every day of my life that I was a burden nobody wanted and would do well to make myself small and useful before someone decided I wasn't worth the food I ate. I don't know who my mother's mother was. My mother died before I was old enough to ask properly, and my aunt would never say more than that we came from bad blood, better forgotten." Thea's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw the 12-year-old girl who must have first climbed these terraces alone, looking for somewhere no one would call her that. I used to think she meant it as an insult about my mother's character, something about a man who wouldn't marry her, maybe, or a debt she never paid. I never once thought she meant it literally. I looked at the chain wrapped around the old stone, warm under frost that wouldn't melt for anyone but her, and I understood. In the wordless way a wolf understands weather before the sky itself changes, that I was looking at the answer to a question the whole pack had spent generations too afraid to ask aloud. "I want to speak with your aunt," I said. Something closed in Thea's face, quick as a door. "She won't tell you anything. She spent longer keeping this quiet than I've been alive to have secrets kept from me." "Then I'll ask anyway. People keep silence for one of two reasons, in my experience, because they're loyal to whatever they're protecting, or because they're afraid of what happens if the silence breaks. Your aunt doesn't sound loyal to you, Thea. That leaves fear, and fear can be reasoned with if a king is patient and doesn't come in demanding." "You'll go alone." "I'll go as her alpha king asking a question, not as a man threatening her hearth. That's the only way this kind of silence ever gives anything up honestly." Thea's aunt lived at the far edge of the hold proper, in a narrow stone house that backed onto the woodline, the kind of house built by someone who wanted to be near enough to the pack for safety, and far enough to avoid being looked at too closely. Her name, I learned before I knocked, was Sorcha Windle, Thea's mother's sister, unmarried herself, known in the hold mostly for keeping to herself, and for the particular sourness with which she was said to regard her niece. She opened the door already frowning, and the frown did not soften when she saw who stood on her step. "My lord," a stiff bow, quick, clearly meant to end the visit before it began. "I don't imagine you've come about anything good." "I've come with a question, Sorcha, about your sister." Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise, I noted. Dread, long carried, the kind that comes from waiting years for a knock you always half expected. "She's been dead a long time, my lord. There's little left to say about her." "There's a great deal left to say, I think, and you've been the one saying none of it." I kept my voice even, the way I would with a spooked animal or a frightened subject, not a king demanding tribute. "I'm not here to punish you for what you've kept quiet. I only want to understand why. She didn't invite me in. I don't think she owned the kind of hospitality that extends to a king. She clearly wished had never come knocking. But she stepped out onto the frost-hard step and pulled the door shut behind her, as though whatever she was about to say wasn't fit for even her own walls to hear. "My sister never told me everything," Sorcha said. "But she told me enough to frighten me half out of my senses when I was young, and frightened enough that I've spent 20 years making sure her daughter stayed small and unnoticed. Because the alternative was always that someone would notice her the way I was warned someone might someday, and it would end the same way it ended for the woman we came from." "Say the name," I said, gently as I could manage with my wolf pushing hard against my ribs. "Isol." Sorcha's voice cracked on it, the first name in generations of her family to be spoken aloud in that house without flinching from the ceiling, as though she expected the stones themselves to report her. "My great-grandmother, if the story's true, and my sister always swore it was, sworn to her by our own mother on her deathbed like a curse passed hand to hand instead of a crown. A Luna erased for speaking against the wrong king. A line that survived only by every woman in it agreeing, generation after generation, to disappear a little more than the last. And you decided Thea would disappear the most. Sorcha's chin came up, defensive now, years of guilt curdled into something sharper. I decided Thea would live, my lord. Do you understand what happens to a bloodline the crown decides to erase if it ever resurfaces? I raised her hard because soft girls with royal blood and no protection get themselves noticed, and noticed girls from erased lines get themselves disappeared, properly this time, permanently. I told her she was worthless because worthless girls get left alone. I have hated myself for it every single day since her mother died and left her to me, but I would do it again tomorrow if I thought it kept her breathing. I stood a long moment in the cold, looking at a woman who had spent 2 decades being cruel out of a terror, so old it had outlived every reason for it, and felt something in my anger toward her soften into something closer to grief. The king who erased her is 100 years dead, I said quietly. The fear outlived the danger. It usually does, when no one's alive left to say it's safe to stop. Sorcha's composure finally broke just slightly at the corner of her mouth. Is it safe? It's about to be, I said. I intend to make sure of it myself. I did not tell Thea, when I returned to the terraces, everything her aunt had said. Some of it was Sorcha's to carry, not mine to hand over second hand, and I have learned a king's silence can be a mercy as easily as a cruelty, depending on what it protects. But I told her enough, that her aunt had not been cruel out of hatred, but out of a fear 20 years too old to still be governing anyone's life, and that the fear, whatever shape it had taken across 4 generations of women taught to make themselves smaller, ended with her. Thea listened with her arms wrapped around her knees, the firelight from the small brazier she kept up on the terraces for warmth throwing shifting shadows over a face working hard to hold something back. She could have told me, she said finally, instead of just making me feel like nothing for 20 years and calling it protection. She was wrong to do it that way. I won't pretend otherwise on her behalf, but I don't think you were ever nothing to her, Thea. I think you were the only thing left of her sister, and she was so afraid of losing you the way she'd lost everyone else in that line that she chose to make you invisible rather than risk you being seen and taken. I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, careful not to close the last of that distance without her leave. It doesn't undo what it cost you. I only want you to know the shape of it, before we finish what we've started, so you're not walking into tomorrow with a lie about yourself still sitting in your chest. She was quiet a long while, watching the brazier's small flame gutter and steady in the wind. What happens tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow I bring this into the light where it belongs, if you'll let me. I've spent a week finding pieces of a story 100 years dead, a queen erased, a line scattered, a grave chained shut and a girl left to tend it alone without ever being told why she felt called to it. I won't drag you into the pack's sight like a spectacle if that isn't what you want. But I think you've spent your whole life being made small for a truth that was never ashamed to hide. I think it's time the hold learned what it did, and to whom, and I think you deserve to stand in the middle of that reckoning instead of being talked about in it from a distance, the way you've been talked about your whole life already. Thea turned to look at me then, and in the brazier's low light I could see the exact moment something in her, some old, tired, defensive thing, finally, cautiously, set itself down. I've spent 10 years up here alone, she said. I don't know how to be looked at instead of overlooked. I don't know if I'll do it well. You don't have to do it well, I said. You only have to stand there and be exactly who you already are. I promise you that will be more than enough. She reached out slowly and set her hand over mine where it rested on the cold stone between us. The chain beneath both our palms had gone warm again, the way it had the first night, though we hadn't meant to test it, as though the ground itself had simply been waiting for the two of us to agree, at last, that it was time. "Then let's finish it," she said. "Together this time, not just me alone in the dark hoping someone eventually asks the right question." "Together," I said, and meant it the way I have never meant a king's promise before, not as a decree, but as a vow between two people who had, without either of us quite choosing the moment, become each other's. I called the pack elders. I called Bram and Marin, wrapped warm against the climb and clearly satisfied to finally be climbing it after a lifetime of silence. She'd carried longer than most people live. I called Sorcha, too, though I gave her the choice not to come, and to my quiet surprise she came anyway, standing at the very edge of the gathered crowd with her hands twisted in her shawl like a woman bracing for a blow she'd earned and meant to take without flinching. I sent for the oldest ledgers in the archive, the ones with pages cut out clean by a hand 100 years gone that had thought cutting was the same thing as making something unhappen. And I asked Thea to stand beside me at the sealed cairn, in front of everyone who had ever called her the Bone Girl and meant it as a cruelty. She came in her plain work dress, chin level, hands steady, though I could feel through a bond barely 2 weeks old and already too strong to name anything, but what it plainly was, how much it cost her to stand there and be looked at instead of overlooked, after a lifetime of training herself to want exactly the opposite. The whole hold had gathered by mid-morning, drawn by rumor before I'd even finished sending word. Word travels faster than any messenger in a pack this size. And a king calling for the elders and the archive and the mysterious girl from the terraces all in the same breath was not a thing anyone was going to sit at home and miss. I looked out at them, elders in their winter furs, younger wolves craning for a better view, children held up on shoulders to see over the crowd, and here and there, the particular, familiar faces of people I knew had, at some point in Thea's life, called her the Bone Girl and laughed. 100 years ago, I said, and let my voice carry the way a king's voice is meant to carry. This pack erased a Luna Queen for the crime of telling an unfit king the truth he didn't want to hear. We chained her grave. We forbade her name. And in doing so, we let her bloodline grow up unknown and unwanted in our own halls, generation after generation, tending the very stones that should have honored her, while we called the girl who did it touched in the head for caring. I let that land watched shame move through the crowd like weather crossing a field, faces dropping, shoulders curling inward as people remembered plainly exactly which unkind word they'd used and when. I will not carry that silence forward another day. Whatever this stone answers to, it will answer in front of all of us today, honestly or not at all, because a truth kept secret out of fear is still, eventually, only a truth waiting for someone brave enough to ask it properly. I took Thea's hand. She did not hesitate this time, though I felt the tremor in her fingers before her grip steadied against mine. Together we pressed our joined palms to the worn, warm stone, and the silent terraces, silent no longer, answered. The chain did not break so much as it simply ceased to be necessary, falling away link by rusted link into the snow with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Light rose from the cairn, not fire, not quite moonlight, but something both pale silver, wolf-shaped, thin as breath at first, and then not thin at all. They came up out of the frost one by one, translucent and unmistakable, a whole line of great spectral wolves with eyes like banked coals, more of them than I could easily count, until the ground around the cairn seemed to shimmer with them, and every one of them turned unerringly toward Thea and lowered their heads. The pack went to its knees before I had to command it. Old habits of reverence, I think, remember themselves in the blood faster than old habits of forgetting ever managed to bury them. Isolt's line, Marin breathed, somewhere behind me, her milky eyes wet now, unashamed of it, her old hands pressed to her mouth. Blood does tell in the end. It always does, my lord, no matter how hard anyone works to make it forget itself. Thea stood in the center of it, the light, the kneeling wolves, the kneeling pack, 100 years of erasure undone by nothing more than her hand refusing to stop caring for a grave no one wanted her to touch. And I saw, for the first time since I'd found her alone in the frost, something on her face that wasn't calm or tiredness or the flat armor of a girl who'd learned not to hope for anything better than being left alone. It was wonder, her own, finally permitted, spreading slow across her features like sunrise over frost. Near the back of the crowd, I saw Sorcha sink to her knees with the rest of them, not from ceremony but from something that looked closer to relief, tears cutting clean lines down a face that had spent 20 years being careful not to show anyone what she carried. Thea saw her too. I felt her hand tighten in mine, but she didn't look away from her aunt, and after a long moment, something passed between them that wasn't quite forgiveness yet, but was, at least, the very beginning of the road toward it. "You're not the bone girl," I said, quiet enough that it was only for her, though every wolf in that clearing surely heard it anyway, carried on a wind that seemed, that morning, to want everyone to hear. "You never were. You're the last of a queen this pack was too afraid to remember, and I am done being afraid, and I am done letting fear write the story of who you're allowed to be." I did not ask her to be my Luna as a king granting a favor, the way it might have looked to anyone watching from a distance, a crown offered as a kindness. I asked her the way I would have asked her if she'd still been a stranger kneeling in frost with nothing to her name but a rag and an iron pick, and a stubborn kind of loyalty to the forgotten. Because that, more than any bloodline, more than any silver wolf kneeling in the snow, was the thing I had fallen for, somewhere in the space of a handful of cold nights on a terrace nobody else would climb. "Stay," I said. "Not because the stone says you should, and not because 100 years of history has decided it owes you a crown. Because I am asking you myself, as the man who found you in the frost and could not stop thinking about you since. Because whatever this ground has waited 100 years to tell everyone else, I have known for 2 weeks already, in the only way that ever really matters, that I would rather stand beside you on a frozen terrace than anywhere else in this hold, crown or no crown, wolves kneeling or not." She looked at the wolves, at the pack on its knees, at her aunt weeping quietly at the edge of the crowd, at the chain lying broken and harmless in the snow, and then at last at me. And I watched a lifetime of being told she was unwanted rearrange itself, piece by piece, behind her eyes into something that finally had room for wanting something back. "I've spent my whole life tending graves people wanted forgotten," she said, her voice steadier now than I'd ever heard it, carrying easily across the hushed clearing. "I think I'd like for once to be someone people remember on purpose, and I think," she added, softer only for me, "I'd like to spend the rest of it beside someone who asked me a real question instead of giving me an order, because you're right. Nobody's ever done that before." We buried nothing that day. Instead, the pack did the opposite of 100 years of silence. They cleared every cairn on the silent terraces by hand that very afternoon, elders and pups working the frost together, until Isolt's namestone stood readable for the first time in living memory, her true name cut fresh beside the old, worn one, so that both the erasure and the undoing of it would be remembered side by side. A scar kept visible on purpose rather than smoothed away and pretended gone. Sorcha came to me privately, some days later, and asked, humbly, nothing like the guarded woman who'd met me on her doorstep, whether she might be permitted to help maintain the terraces alongside Thea, not as penance exactly, though I think she meant it partly as that, but as the beginning of something like the relationship 20 years of fear had cost them both. Thea agreed, after a long private conversation between the two of them that I did not intrude on, and though I cannot say the wound between them closed easily or all at once, I watched it begin, slow and real, the way most true healing actually happens, not in a single dramatic reversal, but in small returned kindnesses, repeated until they became a habit stronger than the old one. Bram, for his part, apologized to me privately for the silence he'd kept, though I told him honestly there was nothing to forgive. A second who has learned not to ask his king dangerous questions is not a man who has failed his duty, only a man shaped by a hold that taught him fear was safer than truth. I have made it my quiet work since to teach my hold otherwise, one uncomfortable question at a time. Marin lived 4 more winters after that day, long enough to see Thea properly crowned, long enough to tell the whole true story of Iseult aloud at last, without fear of exile trailing the words. And when she finally passed, it was Thea who sat with her at the end, and Thea who insisted, over the mild protest of the archivists, that Marin's own name be recorded properly this time, in full, with nothing left blank for someone to fill in later and never get around to. Thea plants winter flowers on Iseult's stone every year now, the hardy kind that don't mind frost, the kind that survive exactly the ground everyone once swore was too cold for anything to live in. I go up with her most evenings that duty allows, not as a king checking on his Luna, but as a man who still remembers, clear as the night I met her, the particular warmth of a chain that shouldn't have been warm at all, and how it took a woman the whole hold had overlooked to teach an entire pack, myself included, how to look properly at last, at what had been kneeling in the frost in front of them the whole time, waiting only to be asked the right question.